Welcome to the last part of this video series about calcium nutrition of apples. In this presentation, I'll be covering the basics of certain soil tests, as well as a brief interpretation of the soil reports. I will also show you how to interpret some of the numbers that are on the apple fruit mineral analysis report. Let's first talk about apple fruit analysis. It is very important that you send the apples to the lab and make sure that you get the fresh weight basis mineral analysis, which would produce the numbers in milligrams per 100 grams of fresh weight. I use a lab called the Waypoint Analytical. I sent my fruit there and they would produce this nice little report, usually about 5 to 7 days after I sent them in. I would get these numbers. You get all the nutrients in the fruit as well as some of the critical ratios that are in the fruit. Before we begin, I'd like to point out that it is very important to be as consistent in your sample size and the size of the fruit that you send to the lab as much as possible. While you want to make random samples in the orchard and send in representative fruit, you will also want to make sure that your fruit that you sent in are of uniform size. You don't want to be sending in small fruit together or mixed in with big fruit. You want to be sending in fruit that are about the average size in that orchard. What happens is you're going to have a very different nutrient composition for the big fruit compared to the small fruit. Here in Washington, we size the fruit by the box size. 100 box size is a fairly common size of fruit. Here shown is a Honeycrisp. Honeycrisp has a tendency to get real big, and big fruit for Honeycrisp is not necessarily desirable because they bruise easy and do not store well in storage. And you can see here this Honeycrisp is really big compared to that tennis ball. But anyway, back to my point, you want to make sure that you send in an average size fruit and be as consistent in your sampling as possible in order to get the good representative numbers from the lab results. I showed you these numbers in my previous presentation, but basically these are a fairly general target of the nutrients concentration in the fruit. You can see here for nitrogen it is general desired to have between 25 to 50 milligrams of nitrogen. However, some of the varieties like Honeycrisp, you want as little N as possible, even less than 25 milligrams per 100 gram. For potassium, it's fairly consistent across the board. You want between 100 to 120, sometimes more. For calcium, you want more than 5, although with Honeycrisp, you rarely would get numbers that are more than 5 for the standard variety of Honeycrisp. Some of the newer variety of Honeycrisp can easily get more calcium than 5. Phosphorus, you want more than 10. Magnesium, you want about 5. Usually you want less magnesium than you do calcium. Boron, zinc, it varies a little bit. Then when you look at the ratios, you want ratios to be as low as possible. And for Honeycrisp, you want the ratios to be below 5 for that of the nitrogen and calcium. And for the potassium to calcium ratio, again, you want as low of a number as possible for Honeycrisp, usually around 20 or less. There's usually a difference in nutrient composition between variety. Here's an example of an envy apple versus the Honeycrisp apple. You can see that the envy apple tends to run a lot higher in nutrient concentration in the fruit compared to the Honeycrisp. For example, you have calcium concentration of almost 6 milligrams per 100 grams here for envy. You only have 4 for the Honeycrisp. And generally, if you were to look at the ideal range right here, it really depends on the varieties. Again, you can see that the Honeycrisp will fall below this range a lot. For example, the nitrogen, you want below that range. Phosphorus, you can never get into that range with Honeycrisp. For calcium, you can almost never get into that range. For magnesium, you sometimes gets into that range, and for potassium, you're pretty much within that range with the Honeycrisp. So the ideal range here is not necessarily specific to any variety, so you kind of have to know your variety. Now, you do have more nutrients in the envy than you do in the Honeycrisp. And if you would bite into an envy apple, you will feel that the fruit is a lot more dense than the Honeycrisp. The Honeycrisp will tend to be a lot more crispy and lighter texture to it than the envy does. And the way I describe it is like the melon, where you have the cantaloupe here, where you have a lot meatier fruit when you bite into it, compared to the watermelon, where it's a lot more spongy, a lot of water, a lot crisper. And that's how I would describe the difference between the envy and the Honeycrisp. So, but the point here is that different type or different varieties of apples will have very different nutrient composition, and you need to be aware of that. Nutrients will play a role in how the fruit will color up in the field, and I will cover some of the nutrient profile of the Honeycrisp apples to show you what the differences are between the fruit that has a lot more color and the fruit that doesn't have very much color. And obviously, if you're a consumer at the supermarket, you would probably prefer a fruit that looks like this compared to a fruit that looks like this next to it. So it's very important for the growers to be able to produce a fruit that looks like this. I would like to share this results with you from one of the trials that I did this year on Honeycrisp. In this particular trials, we looked at the calcium nutrition on the Honeycrisp apples. Here at harvest, we laid out the fruit. As you can see that you have a little better red color in this fruit compared to this untreated fruit over here. So we sampled this fruit and we sent them to the lab, and we got these numbers to compare. Here you can see that right off the bat, the nitrogen to calcium ratio is lower in the treated plot compared to the untreated plot. You got the 4.9 versus the 5.4. So the lower ratio is usually better for Honeycrisp. Like I mentioned in my previous presentation, we have a lot of data at Yara that would show that the lower the nitrogen to calcium ratio normally translate to a better color fruit. Then we also have the potassium plus magnesium to calcium ratio. Again, the lower that ratio, the better. Here in this treated plot, you can see that we have higher calcium compared to the untreated plot, lower calcium. The sample that we have here are fairly consistent for all these other nutrients, which is always good when you're comparing apples to apples. We have nitrogen number that are pretty much identical. We have phosphorus number that are over 10, which is good, not much different than untreated. We have calcium number, like I discussed. We have magnesium numbers that are very, very similar. Then we have the potassium numbers that are very similar. Now, in this particular trial, we used the product called the YaraVita Stopit to spray it on this Honeycrisp, and we were able to increase the level of calcium significantly by about 10%. In this case, we increased the calcium level by about 10%. We also decreased the ratio by about 10%. And because of that, we're seeing better color here. Before we move on to the next slide, where I'll show you the samples of the fruit from the lower color and higher color, but that sample didn't make any sense, and I will explain you here before I move to the next slide so you know what I'm talking about. So what I did was I sampled the fruit that had a lot of color, and I sampled the fruit that didn't have very much color. And the results I got back didn't make any sense. And that is because I was not consistent in my sampling. What I should have done is picking the red fruit that were out in the sunlight and pick the fruit that weren't as red, but also in the same area out here exposed to the sunlight. What happens is that the fruit that are exposed to sunlight are more likely to color up, like in this picture here. But when you're picking fruit out here and then you're picking fruit in here and you're trying to compare them to see why they have different colors, it's not going to make any sense, because the fruit out here is going to be redder to begin with because it's getting more light compared to the fruit that are in here. Let me show you. So here's a sample I was talking about. I was out in the orchard with a crop consultant, and I was hoping to show him that the fruit that has higher color will have higher value of certain nutrients that's making them redder in color. But what happened was one person was sampling all the red fruit and the other person was sampling all the low color fruit. Now, all the red fruit were outside on the outer part of the canopy where it was getting a lot of sun and it was coloring up nicely. And all the fruit that did not color up very well, the person picking those fruit had to pick them from inside the canopy. So this is not a consistent way of sampling fruit, and the data shows you just that. Here we see in this data here that the fruit had a ratio of nitrogen to calcium of 5.2, but the lower color fruit actually had even less ratio of nitrogen to calcium, which doesn't make sense. The lower the ratio should be redder. Again, you look at the calcium, this fruit here actually had higher calcium compared to this fruit over here that had higher color. Now, there's many reasons for that. Here, first of all, the fruit that were inside the canopy had lower bricks, which means that they were behind in the maturity. And this fruit out here that were outside of the canopy that were coloring up, they were more advanced in the maturity. See, you see the bricks percentage is higher. And another thing that explains the higher calcium concentration in this lower color fruit is that they're inside the canopy where transpiration is lower. So they were getting higher calcium there. Now you would expect that you get better color with this fruit because they have beautiful ratios here of 5 and 19. However, they wouldn't get any sunlight. These are from standard big trees that had a lot of shade inside the canopy, and this fruit were not coloring up even though they have good ratios. So the planting, the way you plant the trees to make sure that the fruit get exposed to the light as possible is very important. As you can see here in this particular example, the fruit that were outside the canopy were redder, and the fruit that were in the shade did not color up as much. Here's a slide that I should have included in my last presentation when I talked about the effect of the management practices on fruit quality. What we have here is the reflective ground cover. It's very commonly used here in Washington, where the grower would go in and put this reflective material on the ground so that when the sunlight comes down, it helps reflects the light up into the fruit. You can see underneath the fruit, you can see a little bit that it's a little bit shinier because of the light reflection. And that light, they're getting inside the canopy and helping those fruit inside the canopy color up better than without the use of this reflective material. So while the nutrition of the fruit is very important to help them color up nicely, there are other factors as well, such as the exposure to the sunlight, that will explain how your fruit color develops in the orchard. Moving on to bitter pit in apples. Bitter pit is a big problem for susceptible varieties like the Honeycrisp. You can see here bitter pit that fell onto the ground during harvest. The pickers will not pick this bitter pit apples and put them in the bin, so they would just leave them on the ground. You can see how many of them are on the ground from just one tree. Now the bitter pit symptoms will show up in the field, but doesn't mean that it stops there. You can pick a perfectly nice fruit, and those nice fruit makes it to the market. As you can see here, pictures I took from the store. You can see the bitter pit here, bitter pit here, bitter pit here, here, here. Even though this fruit were picked when they had no bitter pit, those bitter pit will continue to manifest on the surface of the fruit. So it is very important that you do all you can to make sure that the fruit has the right amount of calcium so this doesn't happen on the store shelves. Let's take a look at what bitter pit looks like nutritionally. You can see here from one of my trials, we have the really nice looking Honeycrisp apple fruit and the Honeycrisp apple fruit with bitter pit. I sent these fruit samples to the lab separately just to show you the difference in nutrition in this fruit. First of all, you can see that in this good fruit, you get the ratios of 6.2 and 24 for the good fruit. When we look at the bitter pit fruit, you can see the ratios is much higher, 10.3 and 35.7. And then let's take a look at the calcium. You see that on the good fruit, you got the calcium of 4.3. And on the bitter pit fruit, you got calcium of 3.8, which is a lot lower than the good fruit. You also look at the nitrogen of the bitter pit fruit. You have the nitrogen level that's a lot higher. Remember, you want the nitrogen for the Honeycrisp apple, you want them less than 25 milligrams per 100 grams. Here, this fruit already had higher nitrogen than ideal for the Honeycrisp, but this bitter pit one are even higher, 39. That's really high. When you look at the potassium, you look at the factors that drives up the ratios here. You look at the potassium. You got potassium at 99.5 right here in the good fruit. You look down here for the bitter pit fruit. You got 131 milligrams per 100 grams of fresh weight. That higher potassium and lower calcium drove up this ratio right here, as you can see. So if you were to send samples to the lab separately like I did, you will find exactly the same thing between the good fruit and the bitter pit fruit. Here's another example that I'd like to share with you as well. Here we got the good fruit that I sent to the lab compared to the bitter pit fruit that I sent to the lab at the same time. These are again from the same orchards, from the same area of the orchard. Now you can see that this Honeycrisp apples has ratios that are more in line with what I like to see. You got the nitrogen to calcium ratio of below 5, and you got the potassium plus magnesium to calcium ratio of about 21.3, which is closer to the 20. I like to see them right around 20, but this is fairly good profile for Honeycrisp apples. You can see that the phosphorus, you got phosphorus that made it over 10. Every time you see phosphorus that north of 10 milligrams per 100 grams, you tend to have good quality fruit. Adds on to the good ratios, you also have good phosphorus, so you're going to get a nice firm fruit and perhaps even better red color as well. Now, you look down here, the bitter pit fruit. Again, you have nitrogen level that is much higher than the good fruit. You have calcium ratio that is much lower than the good fruit. And the potassium ratio that is much higher, again, than the good fruit. Driving up the ratios, as you can see here, again. Continuing on from the last samples that I showed you, what I did there also was I did an evaluation of the bitter pit. And I found that 80% of total fruit that I sampled were good fruit, and 20% of the samples that I took had bitter pit fruit in it. So I sent those fruit samples to the lab, but what I did not do is to take a representative samples. Basically, you sample the fruit from the orchard indiscriminately. So you just walk through the orchard and you pick the fruit without making sure that they don't have any bitter pit in it. So in an ideal sample, you would have 80% of that fruit being good fruit and 20% of that fruit being bitter pit fruit. And you would send all those to the labs together to get a more representative values. Remember that this value here is just for the fruit that has bitter pit, and this value here just for the fruit that were good fruit. So what are the numbers here? What if you send 100% of your fruit in the orchard to the lab? What would those numbers be? good news is you can find out those numbers by making a weighted average calculation based on these numbers here. Here's an example. So you have your samples for the good fruit, and you got the numbers from the samples for the bitter fruit. What you don't want to do, you don't want to take average of those two numbers, because you know that 80% of it is good, 20% of it is bad. What you want to do is to take a weighted average based on this information. And you can go online and figure out how to make that calculation yourself, but I made it here, and you can see that I got these numbers here. This number would represent what the average fruit in the orchard would look like. And you can see here we have the nitrogen to calcium ratios of 5.6 and the magnesium plus potassium to calcium ratio of 25. Again, if I would have looked at the representative average samples and I saw these numbers, I would tell you that, yeah, you're probably going to end up with some bitter pit. I like to see this number to be below 5. I like to see this number to be about 20, even less. So when I look at these numbers here, I can tell you right off the bat that you will probably be dealing with some bitter pit. And in this case, this particular case, it was true. About 20% of the fruit in the orchard had bitter pit in it. Now, there's a lot more I can talk about fruit, but I like to keep this presentation shorter, so I'm going to move on and talk about soil test. For soil test, I'm going to be talking mostly about the samples that get taken from the orchard using a soil probe like this one. And the samples, I normally take what's called a 6-inch sample. This is about what a 6-inch soil core looks like. So you punch this soil probe into the ground about 6 inches, pull it up, you get the soil, you put it in the bucket, and you do that between 20 to 40 times throughout the orchard to get a representative sample. You mix that soil in real good, and then you put the sample soil in the bag and send to the lab. Wait for the results to come back. There are quite a few type of soil tests you can get out there. Normally, if you contact a lab, a soil lab, they'll give you a list of tests you can do to the soil. And the three most common ones that I like to talk to you about are these. We have the complete extractable soil test, and we have the saturated paste extract soil test, and we have this newer kind of soil test. I call it the raisin kit soil test. I'm not exactly sure what the proper term is for that particular test, but I will be showing you the kit a little bit later in this presentation. The most traditional soil test would be the complete extractable soil test. If you know, you heard of soil testing before, it's probably this one. It's the most common one. And what the lab does is they'll take your soil sample. You send just the soil to the lab. They'll dry the soil, they process it, and they'll analyze it. For the cations, they'll use ammonium acetate to try to extract the cations from the soil particles. For the phosphorus, they'll normally use some sort of an acid extractant, basically just blowing up the soil with acid and try to get all the pee there is in the soil out of it. And now this pee here is not necessarily available pee. They're just testing everything that's in the soil that they can extract out with the acid. Then you got all this other way of extracting nutrients out, but the most important one I like to talk about is this top two here. Then we have the saturated paste extract, where you send the soil sample to the lab along with your irrigation water. The lab will use the irrigation water and the soil, mix them together, let it sit overnight, and suck out the soil solution. And they will analyze that soil solution to see what nutrients is in the soil. Okay, and it is important to understand that, so you're right here. That saturated paste extract. You're looking at the nutrients that are in the soil solution, and you can see here the plants will take up calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and nitrogen the most from the soil solution. When we're talking about the potassium and phosphorus, you're looking more at that diffusion type of uptake from the soil. Where we look at the saturated paste extract, you'll be looking more at these type of nutrients, and you need to understand what you're looking at basically. Now, when we look at this raisin kit is pretty interesting. It uses like a mild extractant that mimics the root ability to extract nutrient from the soil. And you can send a sample in with your irrigation water, and it's normally cheaper and fairly fast way of analyzing your soil. I'll show you more of that later, but they will not give you the soil pH, the chloride, bicarbonate in that report, and you can talk to them about why that is not the case. And here's a graphic representation of what each of the soil tests will measure, just to give you a better visual than the previous slide. So we have the saturated paste extract, which only measures the nutrients that actually are in the soil solution. And I've showed you this in my previous presentation, and you know that the nutrients get dislodged from the soil particle and goes into the solution and goes back and forth quite a bit. But the plants will take up a lot of the mass flow nutrients that are in the soil solution. So and that's why saturated paste extract is very useful to know what type of nutrients and how much of it is in the soil solution. Then we have the raisin kit. The raisin kit uses a mild extractant, so it will measure both the nutrient that's in the soil solution as well as some of the nutrients that easily gets dislodged from the soil particles. Again, it tries to mimic the roots. The roots will try to dislodge these nutrients into the solution. So does the raisin kit. The raisin kit will do just that. It will try to extract some of these nutrients from the soil solution, from the soil particles into the solution, so they can analyze it all together. And then, of course, you got the complete extraction or complete extractable soil test. It will extract all of the cation nutrients that are hanging on to the soil colloids. Most of it anyway. Some of it you can never get out, but generally they'll do a pretty good job at extracting a lot of these nutrients away from the soil colloids and analyze it, and tells you the value, give you a pretty good relative idea of how much nutrients you have in the soil. And here's the lab that I used for the data that I'm about to show you in the next slide. I've sent soil samples to AGQ Labs. They're in California, Oxnard, California, and I used them for the complete extractable test as well as the saturated paste extract test. And that raisin kit that I told you about, I contacted Unibest and I bought a few kit, and I got some data here. This is their report right here, and I'll be showing you the data. So here it is. I summarized all the numbers. Basically, the AGQ lab likes to give you numbers in milliequivalent and whatnot. And for the sake of simplicity, I just converted all the numbers over to part per million, so that they can be easily compared to each other here. Now, as you can see here, first of all, the test that I did with HEQ, they did not give me the nitrate, nitrogen, or the ammonium nitrogen values. Instead, they gave me this total N value. So this is basically total nitrogen that can be extracted from the soil. Basically all the nitrogen that are hiding in the organic matter and whatnot. And this number, the ideal number, is between 1,000 and 1,500. So it looks like I'm actually a little bit low. But looking up some literature, the way you can know how much nitrogen you actually have available for the plant that season is basically between 1 and 4% of that number of total nitrogen in the soil. And in this case, when we look at the saturated paste extract, it gave me the number of 34. It tells me that I have 34 ppm of nitrate nitrogen in the soil, which comes out to be exactly about 4% of this number here, so that is fairly accurate. Now, moving on, you can see that the complete extractable, first of all, it gives you all this value, but one thing that will jump out immediately is that these numbers are high, a lot higher than these two numbers down here. Okay, you got phosphorus of 24 ppm, potassium of 211 ppm, calcium of 1300 ppm, magnesium 234 ppm. Remember, just keep in mind that this particular test purposely extract a lot of nutrients from the soil just to give you a general idea of how much is in there. It doesn't mean that it's available to the plant. It just means that this is what's in the soil. Now, when we come down here, we look at the saturated paste extract. You can see that the numbers are a lot lower. And these numbers are basically the nutrients that are in the soil solution. So when you irrigate your crop, that water gets into the soil and the nutrients gets into that water. And this is what your roots see, nutrients in the water. Now keep in mind that we have the diffusion nutrients here. So you get some of the uptake of this diffusion nutrients through mass flow, but most of it is going to be through diffusion. Now, if you look at these are the mass flow nutrients. When you look at the saturated paste extract, it's more useful to look at these numbers here. You got the calcium. These are actually calcium that can be taken up by the plant. Not these numbers here. It is this number here that plants can actually take up through mass flow into the roots and up to the transpiration stream. Magnesium is a mass flow nutrient, so this is a fairly accurate number of what magnesium is actually available to the plant, not this number here. Then we have the sulfate, that's a mass flow nutrient, and we have the nitrate, that is also a mass flow nutrient. Okay, now, just to point out real quick, these two tests here, I sent the samples in with irrigation water. Why do I do that? Very simple. If you don't send in irrigation water, they'll use distilled water. And distilled water is basically a clean water. It's very hungry of nutrients, so it tends to extract more nutrients out of the soil when you try to analyze the soil nutrients. So you tend to have higher number than this. But when you use your irrigation water will have minerals in them. And those minerals will interact with your soil and generally will yield very different number. And our irrigation water here in Washington has quite a bit of calcium in it. So normally your calcium number will be a little bit higher. Then you see, lastly, I'd like to talk about this raisin kit test. One thing that kind of jumps out is that the raisin kit test will actually give you a number that is somewhat between the two numbers, between the complete extractable and the saturated paste. This is interesting. I'm still trying to learn and understand what these numbers mean, but you can see that it may be a useful tool to have because, okay, for the solution, it's not showing me very much phosphorus, in this saturated paste, and in the complete extractable, it gives me this number, but not all of it is available. So what does this number mean? Maybe this raisin kit will give you a number that is more representative of what the crop can actually take up for the diffusion nutrients here. This might be a very useful kit for determining the actual available nutrients for the plants to take up for these diffusion nutrients. And I would use this saturated paste extract numbers to tell me what's actually in the soil solution to understand how much of the mass flow nutrients I have for the plants to take up. Now, as far as calcium goes, this is a calcium presentation, so let me tell you that in general, you want about 50%, 50 parts per million. You want about 50 parts per million of your calcium in soil solution at all time. This is a fairly general number, but if you have this number in your soil solution, then your plant will not likely to run into a calcium deficiency situation, given that your soil is balanced, that you balance all your cations so that you don't have uptake competition issues. in this particular soil here, you got 63 parts per million of calcium, so you should be good to go there. Okay, here's my last slide, and I just wanted to point out the difference between the test when you use the distilled water. Here's a test that I ran with distilled water and a test that I ran with the irrigation water. You can see here, you just look down, go down here, you see the difference. There's two very different numbers. This is the same soil, just using different water. Distilled water tends to extract a lot more nutrients out of the soil, as you can see here. Okay, and then for the irrigation water, some interactions happen between that irrigation water in the soil, and less of the nutrients showed up in the test. And that is why I rather use tests that are ran with irrigation water, so I know exactly what type of nutrients I'll end up having. And this is that raisin kit test I told you about by Unibest International. It comes in a cup like this. They send the kit in with the distilled water. I normally just dump that water out and I use the irrigation water instead. And you see this little packet that's in there, that's your raisin. And once you put the soil in there and then you have the water in there, it turns into a soupy solution. And that raisin exudes the extractant into the solution. And then whatever nutrients it gets into the solution actually gets back into that raisin right there. So once you close the lid, once you prepare your sample, you put your soil in there, you close the lid, you put it in this prepaid shipping box, and off it goes to the lab. It takes about 3 days to get there, and by the time it gets there, the nutrients have time to become absorbed in this little pocket, and then they analyze what's in that thing right there. So this is an interesting soil test kit. I'm not exactly promoting it. I'm just telling you that it's available and it's interesting. It's definitely a tool that you can use out there. Anyway, that concludes my presentation. On to the next final slide. Well, I'd like to thank you again for watching this presentation, this final part of my 8 parts video series about calcium nutrition of apples. This is just introduction video to calcium nutrition in apples. So, and there are 8 parts of it. I had a lot of fun making it. And in the future, I'm hoping to make more calcium video, but it's going to be more of an advanced calcium video. So just keep an eye out and stay tuned for more. Thank you very much. Goodbye.